The cold hum of containment fields was the only sound in the sterile laboratory. Glass cylinders lined the walls, each housing a prisoner, some still breathing, others reduced to husks of what they once were. The Xerath scientists moved with clinical precision, their tall, segmented forms casting elongated shadows beneath the artificial lights. In the center of the chamber, Saria hung suspended within a crackling energy field. The transparent restraints shimmered with a faint violet hue, holding her weightlessly in place. She no longer struggled. Resistance only invited more pain. Her pale, luminous skin, once smooth, was marred with burns and injection sites. Silvery blood had dried along her wrists where restraints had bitten into her flesh. The pain was constant, an unrelenting force gnawing at the edges of her consciousness. A Xerath scientist, taller than the rest, approached the control panel. His exoskeletal fingers tapped the console, and Saria tensed as a surge of electricity coursed through her body. She did not scream. She had learned long ago that vocalizing pain only encouraged them. Specimen 73 continues to exhibit high resilience to neural stimulation, the scientist noted in his guttural language. The Ilari physiology is proving more durable than anticipated. Increase intensity by 12%. Another scientist obeyed. Saria braced herself as fresh agony lanced through her nerves. Her vision blurred, her mind teetering on the edge of collapse. Somewhere in the distance, she heard the weak cries of another prisoner, a sound that once filled her with sorrow but now barely registered beyond her own suffering. She had lost count of the cycles since her capture. Time had become meaningless in this place of steel and suffering. The Xerath had taken her from her homeworld, from the emerald skies and endless fields of her people's sanctuary. The Ilari were a peaceful race, scholars, healers, artists. They had no weapons, no warriors. The Xerath had seen that as an invitation. Saria clenched her fists, her body trembling as she fought to hold on to what little strength remained. She would not break. She would not give them the satisfaction. A new sound disrupted the monotony of the lab, a low, distant rumble. The Xerath paused, their eyeless faces tilting toward the ceiling. Another tremor followed, shaking the reinforced walls. The lights flickered. Saria barely registered it at first. Her mind, dulled by torment, struggled to interpret the shift in her surroundings. Then, the alarms began to blare. A deep, mechanical voice echoed through the facility. Security breach detected. Unauthorized entry in Sector Theta. The scientists moved quickly. One barked an order to fortify the lab, while another activated a containment lockdown. Saria's restraints tightened, the energy field surging with renewed intensity. She gasped, her body convulsing under the sudden pressure. Then, the door exploded inward. A figure emerged from the smoke, a silhouette clad in dark, flexible armor, a rifle raised at the ready. The Xerath reacted instantly, drawing their own weapons, but the intruder was faster. Bright bursts of plasma lit up the chamber as precise, controlled shots tore through the scientists. The acrid scent of scorched flesh filled the air. Saria blinked through the haze, her breath ragged. The figure advanced, his movements fluid, lethal. He turned, and for the first time, she saw his face. A human. She had heard of them before, seen glimpses in Xerath records. They were warriors, survivors of 1,000 conflicts, unpredictable and dangerous. The Ilari had always feared them, whispering stories of their conquests across the stars. And yet, this one had just killed her captors. The human scanned the room, his sharp gaze locking onto her. His brow furrowed as he took in her condition. Something flickered in his expression. Not indifference, not calculation. Something else. Without hesitation, he moved to the control panel. His fingers danced over the interface, overriding the Xerath security measures with startling efficiency. The restraints around Saria flickered and disengaged. Her body collapsed, but before she could hit the ground, strong arms caught her. Warmth. Not the sterile, biting heat of the lab's lights, but real warmth. Human warmth. Easy, the man said, his voice steady, grounding. I've got you. Saria's instincts screamed at her to pull away, to distrust, to fear. But she had nothing left. No strength. No fight. She sagged against him, her breath shallow. Heavy footsteps pounded in the distance, Zirith reinforcements. The human cursed under his breath, adjusting his grip on her. "I'm getting you out of here," he said, voice resolute. Saria forced her eyes open, looking at him fully. His features were sharp, weathered, his dark hair damp with sweat. There was something strange about him, something she had never seen in the Zirith. Determination. She had spent months trapped in this nightmare, convinced that no one would come, that no one cared. Yet here he was, a human, her unlikely savior. A blast shook the facility, and the alarms screeched louder. The Zirith were coming, but for the first time in a long time, Saria had hope. The blast doors slammed shut behind them as the man, Ryan Carter, dragged Saria through the twisting corridors. His boots echoed loudly against the cold, metallic floor, but his focus was entirely on her, keeping her steady as she stumbled beside him. Every step was a battle for her, her limbs trembling, but she refused to collapse. She was alive, and for now, that was enough. Ryan's hand was warm against her shoulder, guiding her forward with a firmness that made her feel safer than she had in months. She could barely understand why. After all, he was human, the very species that her people had always feared. Yet here he was, pulling her toward an uncertain future, offering her the one thing the Zirith had never given: freedom. The alarm screamed above them, and Saria winced at the sound, the shrill notes rattling her already fragile mind. Ryan's pace quickened, his eyes darting to the hallways ahead. "Stay close," he muttered, his voice low but firm. "I won't let them take you again." She nodded, though her throat tightened. She had been kept in chains for so long, both physically and mentally, that the concept of safety felt strange, almost foreign. The word freedom no longer had the same meaning it once did. Was she free, or was this just a temporary escape? Ryan turned down a narrow corridor, and Saria felt the tension in his body heighten. A faint, metallic hum pulsed from ahead, and she realized that more guards were approaching. Ryan's hand gripped her wrist tightly, his gaze shifting to the side as a group of Zirith soldiers rounded the corner. Instinctively, Saria froze, her breath shallow, but Ryan was already moving. He pushed her to the side and raised his rifle, unleashing a burst of plasma fire. The Zirith soldiers reacted too late. Two of them crumpled to the ground, their bodies smoking from the impact. The others raised their weapons, but Ryan was faster, pivoting and taking down another soldier before he ducked into a side alcove. Saria's heart raced. Her instinct screamed for her to run, to hide, but she did neither. Instead, she watched Ryan as he calmly reloaded and assessed the situation, his face impassive. There was no hesitation in his movements, no sign of fear. The cold efficiency with which he moved was both alarming and oddly reassuring. This man, this human, wasn't just a soldier. He was a protector. "Stay here," Ryan ordered quietly as he peeked out from behind cover. He fired once more, taking down the last of the soldiers. Then he gestured for Saria to follow. She hesitated only for a moment. "Where are we going?" she whispered, her voice hoarse from both fear and exhaustion. "To the hangar. We're getting out of here," he replied without missing a beat. His expression softened just slightly as he looked back at her, but his focus was unwavering. "Do you think you can walk?" Saria nodded, her gaze flickering to the still bodies of the Zirith soldiers. Despite the brutality of their deaths, she couldn't bring herself to feel anything. The pain they had caused her had dulled her sense of empathy. Instead, she felt a bitter sense of justice, the kind that only comes from knowing you've suffered at the hands of monsters. As they moved through the corridors, Ryan's grip on his weapon remained firm, but his attention shifted between Saria and their surroundings. He was leading her through the labyrinthine hallways of the station with practiced ease. He'd clearly studied the layout, knew exactly where to go. His calm demeanor was contagious, and for the first time since her capture, Saria felt herself begin to relax, just a little. Ryan shot a quick glance over his shoulder. "You're holding up better than I expected." Saria met his eyes, her lips pressing into a thin line. "I've been through worse." Ryan raised an eyebrow. "Well, that's good to hear. Means you've got some fight left in you." The compliment, though simple, stirred something inside her. The Zirith had never seen her as anything but an experiment, a specimen. To them, She was little more than an object of study. But this man, this human, saw her as something else. She wasn't just a survivor. She was worth saving. They turned a corner, and the sound of footsteps in the distance alerted them to the fact that reinforcements were on the way. Ryan paused, holding his breath for a moment. Saria did the same, instinctively pressing herself into the wall, her body tense. The footsteps grew louder. Ryan's eyes flicked to her, then to the hallway ahead. We don't have much time. Follow me. He moved swiftly, taking a sharp left and diving into a small maintenance shaft. The narrow space was barely wide enough for them both. But Ryan crouched low and pulled Saria inside, motioning for silence. The sound of boots clanging on metal echoed in the corridor just outside the shaft. Saria's heart pounded in her chest, but Ryan's hand on her arm kept her steady. He didn't speak, didn't even breathe. He simply waited, tense and focused. The footsteps moved past them. For a long moment, all that could be heard was the hum of the station and the pounding of Saria's heart in her ears. When the sounds faded, Ryan let out a quiet exhale. We're good? For now. He turned to her, his face illuminated by the dim emergency lights. You're doing great. We're almost there. Saria nodded, though she was still unsure of the path ahead. The concept of escape was difficult to grasp. She had been in captivity for so long that freedom felt like an illusion. But the human's determination was infectious. He wasn't going to stop until she was safe, and that made her believe, just for a moment, that maybe, just maybe, there was a future beyond the walls of the Zerith's nightmare. As they continued down the maintenance shaft, the sound of distant explosions echoed through the station. Ryan glanced over his shoulder, his lips curling into a thin smile. Looks like we're not the only ones making a move, he said. Saria didn't respond. She just followed, step by step, toward whatever came next. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in months, it felt like hope had a place in her heart. The hum of the escape ship's engines vibrated through the floor beneath Saria as she sat in the small, dimly lit cabin. Ryan was at the controls, his fingers steady as he navigated the ship through the chaotic debris field left in the wake of their escape. The blast from the research station had sent pieces of it scattering in every direction, but Ryan had expertly avoided the larger chunks. Saria's body ached with exhaustion, the toll of her ordeal making every movement feel like a strain. Her legs were stiff, and her mind was clouded with fatigue, but she couldn't afford to sleep. Not yet. Not when she was free. She looked out the small viewport, watching as the remnants of the Zerith station grew smaller in the distance. Her homeworld, the only place she had ever known, was far behind her, and in its place was the endless void of space. Space. She had never been this far from her people before. She had never even imagined leaving the planet. Her people, the Ilari, were peaceful, connected deeply to the land and the sky. They didn't seek conflict. They lived in harmony with the universe, with no need for weapons or war. Yet, here she was alone, floating in the vast unknown, with a human who had just saved her life. Ryan glanced over his shoulder, his eyes narrowing as he assessed her condition. You doing okay? Saria didn't respond immediately. She was still processing everything, the experiments, the escape, the shock of being free. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, she had a moment to breathe, to think, and she didn't know how to feel. The pain, though dulled by the escape, still lingered. She remembered the searing electricity, the needles, the tests. The Zerith had broken her body and mind in ways that were hard to articulate. She had been reduced to a specimen, a thing to be studied. But now, there was no one forcing her to endure. Not really, she said quietly, her voice hoarse from both exhaustion and the ordeal. But I will be. Ryan nodded, then turned his attention back to the controls. Good? You're tougher than I thought. The words felt strange to Saria. Tougher. She had been told she was weak before, by the Zerith, by the captors who saw nothing but an experiment. But Ryan, this human, saw something else in her. There was no pity in his eyes, no disgust, just a quiet acknowledgement that she had survived, that she was more than the suffering she had endured. How long until we're out of their reach? She asked, her gaze flickering to the instruments on the console. We're already clear of the station's gravitational pull, Ryan answered, his tone even. But we're not out of their territory yet. I need to lay low for a while. I'm not sure how much the Zirith know about our location, but I'd rather not take any chances. Saria nodded. The thought of being hunted, chased down by the very creatures who had tormented her, chilled her to the bone. She knew the Zirith didn't let go of their prey easily. If they wanted her back, they would stop at nothing to find her. Ryan paused for a moment, his eyes flicking to the empty space ahead. I've got a contact on a human colony a few jumps away. We can rest there, figure out what's next. Saria swallowed, the enormity of the situation hitting her. What happens next? She didn't know why she asked. Maybe it was the weight of the question hanging in the silence between them, or maybe it was the curiosity, the uncertainty of the future. She had never had to make decisions like this before. Her life had always been dictated by others. The Zirith, her captors. But now, her path was her own, and the freedom felt both liberating and terrifying. Ryan's fingers hovered over the controls for a moment, as if he were carefully choosing his words. You get to decide that. No more experiments. No more cages. He glanced at her then, his gaze steady. You want to go back to your people? The question pierced through her like a cold wind. Go back? Saria's heart stuttered at the thought. She had been torn from her world, her family, and everything she knew. Her people, the Ilari, were far from the human war machines, far from the violent realities of the galaxy. They were gentle, philosophical, and far too trusting. She doubted her people would even recognize her now. She wasn't the same girl who had once roamed the fields of her home. She had been changed. But what would her future be, wandering alone in space? What kind of life could she make for herself with no home, no family, no purpose? I don't know, she admitted, her voice breaking the silence. I don't know if I can go back. Ryan nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. That's okay. You don't have to know right now. We'll figure it out together. Saria looked at him, really looked at him for the first time. His face was hardened by years of battle, of sacrifice. But his eyes, those were full of something else. Something kind. Something that wasn't born of violence or conquest, but of compassion. She had never thought she would find compassion from a human. And yet, here it was, in the form of the very person who had ripped her from the nightmare and given her a chance at something new. She swallowed hard, suddenly overwhelmed by a swell of emotion. She had no idea what the future held, but for the first time in months, it didn't feel like a prison. Ryan's voice cut through the silence again. We're not done yet, but we've got time. You'll be safe, I promise. The words echoed in her mind, the weight of them settling deep in her chest. She didn't know where her journey would lead, but with him at her side, with someone who saw her, not as a victim, but as a person, she felt like she could find her way. The stars outside the viewport seemed a little brighter now, and the endless void didn't seem quite so empty. This was only the beginning.